He paid her father's gambling debt with a pouch of raw silver. Every ounce he had spent 3 years pulling from a frozen creek in the Montana high country. To her, he was a grim, weathered stranger who had purchased her obligation like a man settling a land lien. She didn't know the truth that had driven him down from the mountains. He was the only person alive who knew what she had buried in the cold ground 11 years ago, and he had never, not once, stopped carrying it for her. The winter of 1883 came early to the Powder River Basin, riding in on a northwest wind that stripped the last brown leaves from the cottonwoods and sent the cattle bunching against the fence lines by the first week of November. For Edmund Tate, the cold was just another creditor. He owed money to more men than he could count on both hands, and the most dangerous of them was sitting on a bay gelding in the frozen ruts of his front yard. Vance Drummond was not a violent man by nature. He was something colder than violent, a calculator. He operated out of Miles City, holding promissory notes the way other men collected land deeds, and he had a gift for finding people at their worst moment and making certain that worst moment never fully passed. Edmund Tate had borrowed $420 from Drummond's lending office 2 summers ago, after the floods took the crop and the bank in Billings stopped returning his letters. The interest had been running ever since. On this particular Tuesday, Drummond sat his horse with the patient, unhurried ease of a man who already knew how the conversation would end. 2 hired men flanked him, not lawmen, but men who wore their guns low and didn't bother to smile. Edmund stood in the yard in his worn coat, hat in hand, the way a man stands when he is about to ask for something he knows he won't receive. Inside the small frame house, 22-year-old Laurel Tate stood at the kitchen window, with her hands pressed flat against the cold glass. She had her mother's sharp eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. And both of those things were working against her as she watched the scene unfold. She could not hear the words through the warped window frame, but she had heard enough conversations like this one to fill in the gaps. Her father's shoulders dropped. That was always the tell. Drummond's voice carried thin and clear through the still air. "Edmund, I have been patient with you for 2 years. Patient is not a condition I maintain indefinitely. You owe me $420 plus the accrued interest, which brings us to just over $500. I want the money, or I want the Powder River parcel. I have a buyer in Billings who will take it off my hands before the ground freezes hard." Edmund's voice cracked at the edges. "The parcel is the only thing keeping us fed, Mr. Drummond. Without that grazing land, the cattle have nowhere to winter." Drummond exhaled slowly, his breath pluming white in the cold. His eyes drifted past shoulder toward the house, settling on the window where Laurel stood. A slow, deliberate consideration moved across his face. "There is a third arrangement," he said. "My household in Miles City requires a capable woman. Someone to manage the domestic staff, keep the accounts, attend to correspondence. A labor contract for 3 years would satisfy the debt entirely." Edmund recoiled as if the words had physical weight. Inside the house, Laurel's breath stopped in her chest. She understood exactly what managing Drummond's household meant. She had heard enough talk in the Miles City dry goods store to know the kind of man he was behind the doors of that big sandstone house on the hill. Before her father could find his voice, a sound pulled every head in the yard toward the road. A rider was coming down from the north, moving at a steady walk that somehow felt inevitable. The horse was a big gray quarter horse, heavily muscled, its breath streaming in the cold air. The man in the saddle was broad through the shoulders, dressed in a heavy canvas duster and a battered felt hat pulled low against the wind. A Winchester rifle rested in a saddle scabbard at his knee, and he rode with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years alone in country that did not forgive carelessness. His name was Callum Reed. In the settlements along the Musselshell River, he was known primarily by reputation. A solitary placer miner who wintered in the crazy mountains and came down twice a year to sell silver and buy supplies. He was not known as a friendly man, or an unfriendly one. He was known as a man who watched everything and said very little. Callum pulled the gray horse to a halt between Drummond's men and the homesteader. The temperature in the yard dropped another degree. "You're blocking the road," one of Drummond's hired men said flatly. Callum didn't look at him. He looked at Edmund Tate, then at the house. For a moment, his gaze met Laurel's through the glass. She felt it like a hand pressed against her sternum, not threatening but anchoring, the way a doorframe feels when the floor beneath you is unsteady. "I heard the terms," Callum said. His voice was unhurried, a low and deliberate thing, like a river running under ice. "This is a private matter," Drummond said sharply. Callum reached into his coat and withdrew a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it from his hand and let it land in the frozen dirt between the horses, a dull metallic thud that sent a small puff of frost into the air. $540 in raw silver," he said. "Weighed and assayed in Billings last month. The debt is paid. The girl's contract is mine." The hired man nearest to Drummond dismounted, crouched, and opened the pouch. He looked up at his employer with widened eyes and nodded. Inside the house, Laurel felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Her father's knees nearly buckled with relief, and then buckled further with something else. Something that looked like grief. Her mother appeared from the back room, took in the scene through the window, and made a sound that Laurel would not forget for the rest of her life. Callum dismounted. He walked to the porch steps and stopped at the door without opening it. "I'm not Drummond," he said, through the wood. His voice was quiet enough that only someone on the other side of the door could have heard it. "I need a wife for the winter. Someone to keep the house at the claim while I work the creek before it freezes solid. You'll have your own room. You'll be fed and warm, and no one will lay a hand on you." That's more than Drummond was offering, and we both know it. The door opened. Laurel stood in it, looking up at him. He was taller than she had realized, and older, somewhere around 30, with a face that had been weathered by altitude and cold into something spare and difficult to read. There was a thin scar along his jawline that disappeared into several days of dark stubble. She looked past him at her father, who had his face turned away. She looked back at the man in the canvas duster. "I have 15 minutes to pack," she said. It wasn't a question. 10, he said. "Storm's coming." She packed her good wool dress, her grandmother's Bible, a tin of dried sage, her mother pressed into her hands at the last moment, and the small watercolor set she had carried since she was a girl. She did not cry when she left. She had cried when she was younger, over smaller things, and somewhere along the way the well had run dry. She stepped out of the house, climbed up onto the spare horse. Callum had brought on a lead rope, and did not look back until the cottonwoods on the ridge swallowed the house from view. The ride north and west toward the crazy mountains took 4 days. They traveled mostly in silence, which Laurel had expected, but the silence was not hostile. It was the silence of a man who did not speak unless he had something worth saying, a condition she found, after the first day, more comfortable than she had anticipated. He chose campsites out of the wind, made fires that were small and hot, cooked without complaint. And when the temperature dropped hard on the second night, he handed her his duster without a word and spent the night in his wool coat at the edge of the fire. She watched him the way a person watches a wild animal that is not yet sure whether to approach, noting that he never yelled, never demanded, never did any of the things she had braced for. On the third morning, she made coffee with the grounds from his pack and handed him a tin cup before he asked for it. He took it, held it in both hands for a moment, and said, "Thank you." 2 words. But the way he said them made her look up. He was already looking at the mountains. By the 4th afternoon, the crazy mountain foothills had given way to genuine altitude. They climbed through timber, lodgepole pine, and Engelmann spruce pressing close on both sides, until the trail crested a steep ridge and opened without warning onto a high valley that made Laurel's breath stop entirely. A frozen creek wound through the valley floor, lined with snow-humped willows. At the upper end, against a granite outcropping that blocked the north wind, sat a claim cabin, solid, square-timbered, with a properly mortared stone chimney, already putting out a thin thread of smoke from a banked fire. A woodshed stood to one side, stacked to the rafters. A small stable, a stone-walled root cellar cut into the hillside. It was not what she had expected. She had expected privation. This was a fortress against winter, assembled by a man who took the cold personally. Callum helped her down from the horse, with a brief grip at her elbow that was professional and impersonal, and made her aware, for a fraction of a second, of exactly how long it had been since anyone had touched her with any kind of care. Inside, the cabin was warm and ordered. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, flanked by shelves of organized provisions. A narrow bunk was built into the far wall. A larger rope bed with a heavy wool blanket occupied the opposite corner. "You take the rope bed," Callum said, shrugging off his duster. "I've slept on the bunk for 3 years. It suits me." Laurel set her bag down and looked around the room carefully, the way she always looked at new spaces, cataloging, assessing, trying to find out the point of danger. Her eyes moved over the stove, the shelves, the small writing table near the window, the mantelpiece above the hearth. She stopped. On the mantelpiece, between a box of rifle cartridges and a small jar of pine pitch, was a watercolor painting. It was small, barely 4 inches square, painted on a piece of brown paper that had been flattened and dried against a board. The image was a red-tailed hawk, wings spread, caught in a moment of turning against a pale winter sky. It was not the hawk that stopped her breathing. It was the brushwork. She knew that brushwork. She had made it. She crossed the room in 3 steps and lifted the painting from the mantelpiece with hands that were not entirely steady. She turned it over. On the back, in the careful pencil script of an 11-year-old girl, were the words, "For whoever finds the hawk, keep watching the sky. L.T." The room tilted. She was 9 years old again, sheltering under a collapsed barn roof in the aftermath of a spring tornado near Glendive, Montana, terrified and alone, her father gone to find help, the storm still throwing debris across the broken prairie. A boy, maybe 15, lean and serious, had crawled into the shelter beside her and stayed without being asked. He had not offered false comfort. He had simply stayed, which was the thing she had needed most. When her father finally appeared 3 hours later, the boy was gone. She had left her watercolor set behind in the wreckage. She had not thought about it in years. Laurel stood in the center of the cabin, with the small painting in her hands, and turned slowly to look at the man hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "Glendive," she said. Her voice was barely above a breath. "The tornado. 1872. The Lindstrom barn." Callum went still with his coat halfway off the peg. The silence in the cabin was enormous and warm, and entirely different from all the silence that had come before it. Slowly, he turned around. He looked at the painting in her hand. Something moved through his face that she had not seen there yet. Not guardedness, not the careful blankness he wore like a second coat, but something older and more exposed, like rock that has been under snow for a very long time. "I kept it," he said simply. "I kept the whole kit. It was in the shelter when I went back the next day to check if anyone had been left behind. There was no one to return it to." "You went back," Laurel said. "I always went back to check." She held the painting out toward him, her hand not quite steady. "You recognized me, in the Powder River yard." "The way you hold your hands when you're frightened," Callum said. "Same as you were holding them in that barn, pressed flat against something solid." He paused. "I had come down to buy supplies in Miles City. I heard Drummond talking in the hotel dining room. Heard what he had planned for your father's land. Heard what he intended for you." He looked at his boots. "I had the silver. It was what I had been working 3 years toward, to file the claim legally in the spring. I made a different calculation." Laurel felt the words move through her chest like heat from the stove. He had not purchased her. He had spent the only substantial thing he owned to make certain she was not purchased by someone else. "You gave up your claim," she said. "Silver is just cold metal in the ground," Callum said quietly. He turned back to the coat peg, his voice returning to its usual measured evenness. There's venison stew in the pot from yesterday. Should still be good if you want to heat it. He walked out to see to the horses, pulling the door gently shut behind him. Laurel stood in the warm quiet of the cabin for a long moment, holding the small painting of the hawk with both hands, listening to the wind beginning to rise against the eaves. Outside, the first real storm of the winter was coming in from the northwest. Inside, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Laurel Tate did not feel afraid of what was coming. The storm that locked the crazy mountains in the first week of December was not a polite one. It arrived before dawn on a Thursday and stayed for 6 days, burying the valley in 4 feet of new snow and dropping the temperature to 30 below by the end of the first week. The creek froze solid to the bottom in places, silencing the last sound of running water, and the world outside the cabin windows became a uniform, impenetrable white. Inside the cabin, the forced proximity of survival created its own kind of intimacy. Callum worked at the claim face for the first 2 hours of each morning, whatever section of the creek channel hadn't frozen yet, then returned to the cabin to thaw out and repair equipment. Laurel took over the cooking entirely, without being asked, and proved a systematic and resourceful manager of the limited provisions. She reorganized the shelves, mended a split in Callum's spare boot with sinew she found in his repair kit, and read aloud from her grandmother's Bible in the evenings when the lamp oil warranted it. He listened without commenting, which she had initially taken for indifference, and which she gradually understood was respect. He taught her to reload the Winchester correctly. He was patient about it in the way he seemed to be patient about most things, not with warmth exactly, but with a complete absence of impatience, which amounted to nearly the same thing. He showed her how to read the snow for animal signs, how to set the draft on the stove to burn through the night without smothering, how to pack a wound with the pine, pitch, and dried yarrow he kept in a tin on the middle shelf. She taught him, without fully intending to, how to sit still in a room without being occupied. He had come in one afternoon to find her at the small writing table, working on a painting, just the snow-covered ridgeline visible through the window, rendered in 2 colors of diluted ink, and he had sat down on the bunk across the room and watched her work without speaking for 40 minutes. When she looked up, she found him utterly at ease in a way she had not seen him yet, his hands loose in his lap, the perpetual alertness around his eyes quieted to something slower. "You do this often?" he asked. "Every day I can," she said. "It's how I slow my thinking down." He looked at the ridgeline painting for a moment. "I would like to learn that," he said, and said it as simply as he said everything. They were 2 people who had each, in different ways, learned to take up very little space in the world. That winter, in that small cabin at 9,000 feet, they discovered what it was like to fill a room exactly the right amount. January came in with its teeth bared. The cold was a presence, not a condition. A thing that pressed against the cabin walls from all sides and found every gap in the thinking. Game had dropped into the lower valleys, and Callum had to travel farther each day to hunt. On the night of the 23rd, Laurel woke to the sound of the horses panicking in the stable, a shrant-prick percussion of hooves against timber, nothing like the ordinary sounds of the night. The bunk was empty. She was out of bed and at the door before the thought fully formed. And then Callum was there, already pulling on his boots, already reaching for the rifle over the mantelpiece. "Stay inside," he said. He grabbed the lantern and went out into the black and bitter cold. Laurel pulled her coat over her nightgown and went to the window. She could see the swinging yellow arc of the lantern moving across the yard, and then she saw what had frightened the horses. A mountain lion was working at the stable door. A big one, desperately thin, its ribs showing through its winter coat. It had been driven down from the high rocks by the famine of the deep cold, and it was past the point of caution. Callum raised the rifle. The lion turned from the stable and charged with the explosive speed of pure desperation. The shot and the impact happened almost simultaneously. A deafening crack, the lantern flying, the yard going dark. Then a single horrible sound that Laurel registered before she had fully processed what it was, and then silence. She did not hesitate. She took the burning length of pine from the stove box, wrenched the iron bolt back, and ran barefoot through the snow. She found Callum 20 feet from the stable. The lion was dead beneath him, one massive paw still curled against his side. The shot had been good, through the skull clean, but the animal's momentum had carried it into him, and its claws had found purchase before the lights went out. His left thigh was torn open through the canvas pants, and the ribs on his left side showed 3 deep parallel gashes that were bleeding steadily into the snow. Laurel did not scream. She had been frightened into a clear and practical focus, the kind that arrives when there is simply no alternative. She rolled the lion off him. She did not think about how heavy it was. She got her hands under his arms and pulled him, inch by ground measured inch, back across the yard and through the door and onto the rug in front of the stove. For 3 days the fever had him. She did not sleep. She kept the stove burning hot, changed the poultices of pine pitch and dried yarrow every 4 hours, and held him against the shaking when the chills came. She talked to him when the fever ran highest, not expecting any response, just keeping her voice in the room as something constant and present. She told him about her mother's garden in the years before the floods. She told him about the watercolor kit she had brought to the Lindstrom barn because she had been planning to paint the river that afternoon before the sky turned green and the world came apart. On the morning of the 4th day, his eyes cleared. He looked at the ceiling of the cabin for a moment, then turned his head to find her sitting in the chair beside him, her hands wrapped around a cold tin cup, asleep upright. He did not wake her for a long time. When she finally startled awake, she found him watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face. In all the weeks they had shared that cabin, not the careful neutrality he wore by habit, not the brief warmth that surfaced occasionally around the edges of a conversation, but something open and unguarded and entirely unambiguous. "You stayed," he said. "You stayed in a collapsed barn for 3 hours," Laurel said. "For a frightened child you had never met." He was quiet for a moment then. "That was different." "It wasn't," she said. By March, the snow on the southern slopes was beginning to settle and compact. The creek was opening at the shallows, and the worst of the winter had passed. They were not 2 careful strangers anymore. They were something that did not require a name to be understood. The trouble came back with the mud. On a clear morning in the 2nd week of March, Laurel was hauling water from the creek when she heard horses on the high trail. Not 1 or 2, several. She counted the hoof beats without meaning to, the way her father had taught her to count anything that might be dangerous. 4 riders, coming down the switchbacks from the western pass. She recognized Vance Drummond's bay gelding before she recognized anything else about the group. He had brought 3 men with him, and all 3 were wearing the look of men who had been paid to finish something. Laurel set the water bucket down in the snow and walked back to the cabin at a pace that looked unhurried and wasn't. Callum was at the claim face, a half-mile down the valley. She took the Winchester down from above the mantelpiece. She filled her coat pockets with cartridges. She checked the window angles for field of fire the way he had taught her, without even registering that she was doing it. She threw the iron bolt and waited. Drummond pulled his horse up in the yard and looked at the closed cabin with a particular kind of irritation. The irritation of a man who expected easier work. "Raid!" he called out. "I know you're in there. You bought a contract with Silver you hadn't registered. That makes your lien invalid under territorial law. Send the girl out with the paperwork on her father's debt, and I'll let you walk off this mountain." Laurel levered around into the chamber of the Winchester. "Mr. Reed is at the claim," she called back through the window frame, keeping her voice flat and carrying. "And I'm afraid I don't have any paperwork for you, Mr. Drummond. My father's debt was settled in full. You took the silver." A pause. Then Drummond's voice, lower and more dangerous. That contract was signed under duress. It'll never hold in a territorial court. Now you come out of there, or my men are going to take the door off the hinges. One of the hired men swung down from his horse and started toward the porch. Laurel moved to the side window. She rested the barrel against the window frame, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The shot took the man's hat clean off his head and buried itself in the frozen dirt 6 inches in front of his boots. He froze. "I missed on purpose," Laurel said. "I will not miss again." Chaos broke sideways through the yard. The horses reared and scrambled, Drummond's bay nearly throwing him. One of the hired men fighting to control his mount. The man without a hat backed away from the porch in short, unsteady steps, his hands rising to shoulder height. Drummond, red-faced and furious, wheeled his horse toward the cabin. "Burn it," he snarled at the men on his left. "We'll smoke her out and sort the paperwork from the ashes." Before the words had fully left his mouth, a sound came down from the ridge above the claim. The long, flat crack of a heavy rifle shot echoing off the granite faces of the valley walls, followed immediately by the sound of shattering ice. Drummond's horse bolted sideways, nearly unseating him. On the ridge, standing at the upper edge of the timberline, with his Sharps rifle in his hands, and an angle of fire that covered every inch of the yard below, was Callum Reed. He had heard the horses from the claim face. He had come up the back cut to the ridge in half the time it should have taken, and he was looking down at the 4 men in the yard with an expression that was not angry so much as entirely resolved. "Drummond," his voice carried down off the granite with perfect clarity, "you're on my claim. Under territorial mining law, that gives me the right to remove you by any means I find appropriate. I suggest you find the means inappropriate." Drummond stared up at the ridge for a long moment, calculating. He was a calculator, not a fighter, and the calculation was not going his way. One of his hired men was already edging his horse back toward the trail. Another had his hands still raised at shoulder height and showed no interest in lowering them. "This isn't finished," Drummond said. "It is," Callum said, and his voice made it true. Drummond turned his horse and rode out of the yard. His men went after him in an uneven scramble, and within 10 minutes the sound of hooves on the trail above had faded entirely into the silence of the mountain. Callum came down from the ridge at a controlled pace, and crossed the yard and pulled the cabin door open. Laurel was standing just inside it with the Winchester still in her hands, her coat pockets still heavy with cartridges, her expression composed in the particular way that composure looks when it has been assembled on top of something that shook. He looked at her for a moment, then at the window frame. "Warning shot," he said. "Warning shot," she confirmed. A silence. Then Callum said, "You aimed 1.5 inches above the left brim. I practiced on tin cans in February when you were at the creek." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then the corner of his mouth moved in a way that she had learned, over the course of that winter, constituted a smile. "Drummond will go to the territorial office in Miles City," he said, his voice settling back to its usual level evenness. "He'll argue the contract. He might find a sympathetic ear." Laurel leaned the Winchester against the wall and looked at him steadily. She had been thinking about this since the sound of the hooves on the morning trail. "Then we file first. We ride to Miles City, and we file the claim properly, and we register the labor contract, and we put it all in front of whatever judge will hear it before Drummond can get there." Callum considered this the way he considered everything, without rushing it. "That's a 4-day ride in March mud," he said. "You rode 4 days through November cold to get to me," Laurel said. "I think I can manage mud." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression that had appeared on the morning of the 4th day of the fever, open, unambiguous, making no attempt to be otherwise. "We'll leave at first light," he said. "I'll pack tonight," she said. She turned toward the shelves and stopped. On the mantelpiece, the small hawk painting caught the afternoon light coming through the south window. She crossed to it and took it down, turning it in her hands the way she had on the first night. I want to paint this valley, she said. In spring. When the creek opens and the willows come back. We'll be here in spring, Callums said simply, as though it were already settled, as though the future were a thing he was entirely willing to stand in. The ride to Miles City was 4 days through March mud, and one late snowstorm that caught them in a hollow north of the Mussel Shell and kept them in a rancher's barn for a night, sleeping on opposite sides of a hay bale, with the horses quiet in their stalls and the wind pressing at the old timber walls. They talked in the dark in a way they had not quite managed in the cabin. Without anything to do with their hands, without the structure of work around them, just two voices in the dark and the patient sound of weather. He told her about the years after his family scattered. A father who drank himself west and disappeared into the Idaho Territory, an older brother who had taken to the railroad, and whom Callum hadn't heard from in 6 years. He told her about finding the Silver Creek by accident at the age of 22, following a red-tailed hawk up a draw, of all things, because he had had nowhere better to be, and the hawk had seemed to know where it was going. She told him about her mother, who had died of a fever when Laurel was 16 and left her to manage the household, and her father's increasingly poor decisions alone. She told him about the watercolor kit, how her mother had given it to her on her 9th birthday, 3 months before the tornado, and how losing it had felt, at the time, like losing the last clear thing. "You kept it 11 years, Laurel said in the dark. You didn't even know whose it was." "It seemed important to someone," Callum said. "That seemed like enough reason." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the wind. "It was the only thing I had ever made," she said. "That painting. Everything else I had was either broken or borrowed or someone else's. The hawk was mine." "It still is," he said. In Miles City, they went to the territorial recorder's office and filed the mining claim in both their names, Callum Reed and Laurel Tate, the latter rendered in Laurel's own careful script at the bottom of the document, the ink drying while the clerk blotted it with a sand shaker and looked at them over his spectacles. They went to the circuit judge's office on the second afternoon. The judge, a gray-haired man named Beaumont, who had the look of someone who had heard nearly everything, listened to the full account of the Drummond transaction without interrupting, and then studied the documents for a long, unhurried interval. "The labor contract stands as written," he said finally. "The debt was paid in full at the time of the transaction, recorded by 2 witnesses in the person of Drummond's own hired men. Mr. Drummond has no remaining legal claim on the Tate family property or on the labor of this young woman." He looked over his spectacles at Laurel. "You understand you're free to go wherever you choose, Miss Tate. This man has no legal claim on you either." Laurel looked at the judge. She looked at Callum, who was standing 2 feet away with his hat in his hands, and looking at nothing in particular out the window, his face arranged in the careful blankness he wore when he was trying not to express something. "I'm aware," she said. "They were married the following morning in the courthouse by the same judge, with the court clerk and a woman who had come in to pay a tax bill as witnesses. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Laurel wore her good wool dress, which had been packed in her bag since November and was only slightly wrinkled. Callum had his hat off, and his hair was combed, and he said the words in the same tone he used for everything, quiet, unhurried, entirely meant. The woman who had come to pay her tax bill cried a little. They rode back to the crazy mountains in 4 days of early spring mud and 1 afternoon of actual sunshine that turned the snow on the southern ridges to a blinding silver. When they crested the last ridge and the valley opened below them, the creek was running free at the shallows, and the willows were showing the first pale green of their spring leaves. Laurel pulled her horse up on the ridge and looked at it for a long time. Callum stopped beside her without being asked. "I need the watercolor kit," she said. "It's on the shelf by the window," he said. "It's always been on the shelf by the window." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the valley, and then he turned to look at her, and then neither of them said anything for a while. because there was nothing that needed saying that the moment wasn't already expressing. They had ridden down the ridge and made it halfway across the valley floor when Laurel reached into her coat pocket and felt the small painting, the hawk, the pale winter sky, the brushwork from when she was 9 years old, and the world had come apart. And a quiet boy had sat with her in the wreckage until her father came. She left it there, against her ribs, where she had kept it every day since she found it on the mantelpiece. Some things you don't put back on the shelf.